Hi guys, my name is Karthik and I'm from ExecuteAutomation.com and welcome to section 2 of our Spring Boot for Automation Testing course. And in this section, we can talk about Spring Boot with Selenium integration. So all these days in section 1, we were talking about the basics of Spring Boot and how we can use Spring Boot for automation testing. And in fact, all these days, we try to make sure that the Spring Boot section 1, the basics that we were covering all these days, actually is aligned for an automation tester to get started with the Spring Boot itself. So if you see our project, we didn't really actually wrote like a Spring Boot application, like developed a Spring Boot application and we were trying to run a Spring Boot app, something like that. We didn't really create a microservice for that matter to work with it. But actually, we tried to align the Spring Boot as much as possible for automation testing. Like we created a page object model, like a real page object model, but we didn't really execute the page object model as such, but we tried to use that as much as possible. And also we tried working with the application.properties to read the URLs. And also we saw how we can execute the test using the Spring basic application test using the Spring Boot test annotation. So all these things we tried to align as much as possible for automation testing, even though we were covering the Spring Boot's basics. The reason we actually kept section 1 as aligned for automation testing is in section 2, we are going to be covering the automation testing part, which is nothing but the Selenium's integration. Well, now we're going to be bringing an all new Selenium's library to be used within our project. And we have to make sure that this particular Selenium WebDriver can be accessed as a component for us and then try using them within our Spring Boot's dependency injection. So if you remember in all these days with section 1, we were trying to create an object for the home page, login page, we auto-wired it. And we also auto-wired the main page in the Spring Basic Application Test class. And then we accessed the perform login method and it was working fine. But now Selenium WebDriver is going to be an all new object and we have to auto wire that as well. So we can do that using a component, of course, but there is a good practice of having a configuration in Spring Boot which can do it for you as well. So Spring's @configuration annotation is a part of Spring Core framework, and the Spring configuration annotation indicates that the class has a bean definition method. So the Spring container can process the class and generate the Spring beans to be used in the applications. So you can see that I'm suddenly talking about a @bean annotation. We have never seen this bean before. All these days, we were actually using the component annotation. We used the value annotations. We used the AutoWire annotations. And we of course used the configuration properties annotations and stuff, but we didn't really used the @bean annotation. So in this lecture, we are actually going to be talking bean a lot. The reason why we require a bean is, even though you know that even the component that we do create a class, it becomes like a bean within a container of the Spring Boot that we were looking all these days, like homepage is a component, but still it's a bean for Spring Boot though. So here we're going to create a raw bean because the Selenium object or the Selenium's WebDriver object should be used like a third-party library that we're going to be using within our project. So we need to create an instance of the Selenium WebDriver to be used. And now you can have a question like, why suddenly we are using a configuration whereas the component is going to be doing all these days better for us because it was doing the dependency injection as well? Can't I use the component which we used all these days? Well, the answer is yes, you can use component, because if you see the implementation of @configuration annotation, it's basically going to look something like this. And as you can see, this interface is actually an alias for the component class, which we were using all these days, @component. And you can see it has the @component on the top of the interface as an annotation as well. So the configuration class is basically an alias for the component class. So you can use component if you want to, but it's a best practice in Spring Boot if you're going to be using a third-party library and if you're going to have multiple bean that you're going to be creating, then you should be using configuration. And while we discuss about the API testings, like how we're going to create a microservices, then there is something called as a REST template and then REST controllers, REST service, something like that. So we'll be using different annotations there. I mean, you can just use just one single annotations if you want to, but this is just to separate the business logic with the functionality logic as much as possible just to make your code more readable, and also the best practices defined by Spring. That's why we are using the configurations annotations here. So that's why we will be using over here. So the WebDriver library that we'll be designing is going to look something like this. I mean, we're going to create a class, and then we'll be calling it either a component or a configuration, up to you. And then we're going to create a bean. You can see that there is something called as @bean there. And then we'll be creating a method like getChromeDriver, which is going to be creating a Chrome driver using a WebDriver manager. So it's better to use WebDriver manager. I mean, you can use remote WebDriver or WebDriver if that matters, or even we can use test containers to create a containered WebDriver which can run directly on a container, which we'll be looking at the end of this section. But yes, we can use anything if you want to, but just for the simplicity purpose, instead of downloading all the Chrome driver within my machine, I'm just going to use the WebDriver because it's quite straightforward and simple. So this is how you get the driver instance object, and then we can use it within our test to play around with how we actually do. So we're going to see everything in action, at least in terms of the installation part in our existing project in this video, and then we'll start discussing more about in our next couple of videos. So for that, I'm going to flip to my IntelliJ IDE. All right, coming back to our earlier project, you can see that we have all these stuffs that we have did all these days. It's working pretty good and fine. But now we're going to go all the way to the pom.xml file, and we're going to add the dependency for the Selenium's WebDriver manager, because we have not did that so far. So we're just going to be doing that. So let's go to the Safari, and I'm going to search for the WebDriver manager Maven dependency over here. If this comes like that, and I'm going to see there is a version at 4.3.1. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste the dependency over here. And because we are maintaining the versions, probably we can just create a version like a parameter that we did for the Selenium. So we can say WebDriver manager.version, and oops, it seems like we already have the WebDriver manager's version here. I think we are added on our earlier section as well. Quite good. And we're going to use the latest version, probably this 4.3.1. So now we have the WebDriver managers and everything is looking good over here. And all we're going to do is we're going to start writing the code within our project. So now if you ask me, like, where can I actually write the WebDriver's library that we were talking about? Again, it can be anywhere, because as you know that this Spring basic application test is decorated by the Spring Boot test, and it's going to find all the different components, which is even sitting in any of the class path. Like it can be on the Java's main class path or in the test class path. It's going to find that. So you can create it over here, or you can create it over here within this application, Spring basic application place. Like it can be anywhere, and it's going to find that anyways for you. But it's better that we actually create the package, because it's going to be like a framework where you're going to be holding all the libraries separate from your test. It's better that you can put that libraries on the on this particular project instead of in the test project, and then we can start creating the WebDriver library on this particular location, which is going to be even easy to work with. And over here we're actually going to start creating either the component or the configuration, and then we create the WebDriver library, and then we'll see how it actually works, which we'll be doing in our next lecture.